Fluorescent lights flickered in C-block of Black Iron Penitentiary as Officer Sarah Chen began her routine midnight patrol. After 15 years on the job, she thought she'd seen everything these concrete walls had to offer. She was wrong. It started with the logbooks. Small discrepancies at first, inmates being logged in 2 places at once, signatures that didn't match previous entries. Sarah had blamed it on careless colleagues, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Maybe it's just exhaustion, she had thought, though something gnawed at her every time she passed the logbook room. 3 weeks ago, everything changed. During her rounds, she'd heard humming coming from cell 237. The sound wasn't unusual in itself. Inmates often made noise at night. What disturbed her was that cell 237 had been empty for months, ever since its occupant, Marcus Wade, had died of apparent heart failure. Sarah had approached the cell cautiously, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The humming grew louder, a haunting melody she didn't recognize, as though it was intentionally pulling her in. But when her light swept across the cell interior, she found nothing but the standard issue bed, toilet, and sink. The humming continued. Confused, she stepped closer. Her heart rate quickened, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck rise. She knocked on the bars. No response. Just the echo of her own voice. That night, she couldn't sleep. The humming was still in her head, looping like an insistent siren call. She tried to shrug it off, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus Wade's lifeless body, still and cold on the prison floor. What was that humming? No one else had heard it, she convinced herself. She was just tired. The next night, all the logbooks from the previous month vanished. When they reappeared 3 days later, every entry was written in the same handwriting, Marcus Wade's distinctive scrawl. The administration launched an investigation, but security footage from those 3 days showed nothing but static. Blank. Empty. And then the inmates in C-block started changing. At first, it was just 1 or 2. They'd stare blankly at the walls during yard time. It was unsettling, but Sarah had learned to dismiss small oddities after years on the job. But soon, it became widespread. Sarah noticed it in their eyes first, a vacant, glassy look, as if something had hollowed them out from the inside. They stopped talking during yard time, instead standing in perfect circles, heads tilted at identical angles, watching the guard tower with unnerving synchronization. Even the most volatile prisoners seemed subdued, docile. It's like they were waiting for something. A chilling report came from Officer Rodriguez last week. He had entered cell 237 during a routine contraband search. He emerged 2 hours later, though the search logs showed he'd only been inside for 5 minutes. He handed in his resignation the next day. When Sarah asked him why, he just shook his head, eyes wide, as though struggling to speak. Finally, he whispered, his voice shaking, "They're not all inside the cells anymore, Chin. Some of them are inside us." That was when Sarah started to question her sanity. Tonight was different. As Sarah walked past cell 237, she noticed the temperature drop dramatically. Her breath fogged in front of her face, and the metal keys at her belt grew painfully cold against her hip. She paused, her senses on high alert. The security cameras in the corridor turned to follow her movement, impossible, she knew, since they were fixed units. A strange, unsettling hum filled the air. Not from the cell this time, but from the very walls themselves. It reverberated through the corridor like a twisted lullaby, each note slithering deeper into her mind. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and Sarah's eyes widened as she realized there was no escape from it. Then, the whispers began. Hundreds of voices, speaking in unison, each one distinct, yet somehow melding together into a cacophony. They recited names of those who had worked in C Block in chronological order. The sound was maddening. The names came faster, louder. And then they reached hers. The whispers paused for a moment, and in that terrifying silence, Sarah's blood ran cold. Officer Sarah Chin. The voice was unmistakable. It was Marcus Waite's voice, a rasp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Final log. Time of departure from C Block. The lights flickered once, twice, and then, with a deafening pop, they went out completely. In the darkness, Sarah could hear the creaking of cell 237's door slowly opening. The sound echoed down the hall, sharp and deliberate. Her flashlight shook in her hand. The beam swept over the dusty floor, and she froze. Boot prints, dark and fresh, began to appear one by one in the dust, each step leaving an imprint as if someone was walking toward her. But when she looked up, there was no one there. The logbook in her hand suddenly felt heavier, like it was filled with an invisible weight. She opened it, her breath shallow, and the pages, Marcus Waite's handwriting, were being filled in before her eyes. The final entry read, Officer Sarah Chin, final log. Time of departure from C Block. The pen kept writing, its invisible hand pulling at the ink as it left a blank space after those words. Before she could scream, footsteps echoed behind her. She spun around, but the corridor was empty. The boot prints in the dust now formed a perfect circle around her. She was surrounded. The whispers grew louder, merging into a low, constant hum. And then, Marcus Waite's voice pierced through the noise, closer than before. You always wondered why they called this place Black Iron, didn't you, Officer Chin? It's not because of the steel bars. It's because of what lives in the walls. We're all part of it now. And soon, you will be too. The flashlight flickered, dying just as the words echoed in her ears. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, icy fingers tightening around her, and the logbook's pages rustled violently. The pen moved one last time, finishing the final entry, time of departure from C Block, permanent. In the morning, Sarah's shift was over. But there was no sign of her. Cell 237's door was locked as usual, and the corridor was empty. The logbook sat open on the guard's station desk. No one noticed that the name Sarah Chin had been added to the employee memorial wall. Some say on quiet nights, you can still hear the humming from C Block, the sound of 100 voices, led by Officer Chin, reciting names in perfect unison. Names of those who haven't yet joined them, but soon will. And in cell 237, the logbook continues to fill with entries, written in different hands, documenting the gradual disappearance of everyone who dares work the night shift at Black Iron Penitentiary. But nobody ever talks about it. Not openly. And if they do, their voices are so low, you wonder if the walls of Black Iron have already started to swallow them whole. The tension in Stillwater maximum security prison had been building for months, like a pressure cooker slowly reaching its breaking point. The signs were there, but no one, not the guards, not the warden, not even the inmates themselves, could have predicted the horror that would unfold on that cold October night. It began with a whisper campaign in cell block D. Roman Vasquez, serving 25 to life, had discovered something in the prison's aging maintenance tunnels. During his work detail, he'd found old blueprints suggesting the existence of a sealed ward beneath the prison's east wing, a ward that hadn't appeared on any official documents since 1963. The whispers of something forgotten, something buried deep within the bowels of the prison, began to pulse through the corridors, until even the guards felt the uneasy sensation of being watched in the hallways. The story spread through the prison like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each telling. Some said the ward had housed experimental treatments. Others claimed it was where they kept the most dangerous inmates, the ones too violent even for death row. But Miguel Torres, Vasquez's cellmate, knew the truth was far worse. Torres had been having dreams, vivid, terrible dreams of voices calling from behind the sealed steel door they discovered in the tunnels. At first, they were faint, like a whisper in the dark. But the voices grew clearer each night, their promises insistent. In his dreams, the voices promised power, promised freedom, promised revenge against a system that had wronged them. But they wanted something in return. The price was always the same: surrender. Every night, the whispers clawed deeper into Torres's mind. He began to hear them in waking moments too, while standing in line for meals, in the shower, even when he tried to sleep. His eyes would flutter closed, and the voices would surge again. Sometimes, he'd hear the unmistakable sound of a door groaning on rusted hinges, distant but unmistakable. And each time, the voices would ask for something more. The first disappearance went almost unnoticed. Kevin Zhang, a quiet, unassuming young inmate, vanished during his kitchen duty. The guards assumed he'd somehow escaped, but no alarms had been triggered, no fences had been cut. He'd simply ceased to exist. His absence left an eerie void in the prison, as if the place itself was holding its breath. But when Vasquez casually remarked in the yard one morning, Jean didn't escape. He was taken, no one laughed. No one disagreed. More disappearances followed. Always during the night shift, always without a trace. The guards increased their patrols and conducted more searches, but found nothing. They couldn't see what Torres saw, the shadows that moved against the light, the way the walls seemed to pulse with a subtle, sickly rhythm. He noticed how the air began to thicken, a constant pressure that squeezed the lungs and made everything feel just a little off. Inmates who had once been friendly turned quiet and withdrawn. The ones who weren't withdrawn, they were growing strangely synchronized. They would gather in the yard, standing in concentric circles, murmuring words in a language he didn't recognize, like a ritual, an invitation, perhaps. The night of October 13th, during what would later be known as the Red Hour, Torres knew it was happening. Something in the air had changed. It was as though the prison was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his fingers tapping an unconscious rhythm. Then came the convulsions. Roman Vasquez, his cellmate, began to tremble violently in his sleep. His body twisted in unnatural angles. Torres could hear the wet tearing sounds of his skin stretching, the low, primal growls emanating from his throat. But it wasn't Roman anymore. It couldn't have been. Torres tried to scream, but no sound left his throat. Instead, he simply watched as Vasquez's body contorted and changed. The man's skin split like overripe fruit, revealing something ancient and terrible beneath. It was the kind of horror no man should ever witness, a grotesque thing, something twisted and wrong, taking shape where Roman once had been. The smell was unbearable, like rot mixed with iron. Then, the screaming began, but it wasn't Vasquez anymore. It was something else. The whole cell block screamed with the same guttural, distorted sound. The guards found their weapons useless against what their prisoners had become. They fired, but the bullets slowed, then stopped midair, as if the very atmosphere was rejecting them. The security cameras captured only strobing images of chaos, human shapes moving at impossible angles, corridors filling with a thick, red mist, and things that had once been men now stalking the halls with fluid, predatory grace. Through the fog, Torres stumbled in the dark, his mind unraveling as he realized that whatever had awakened in the prison wasn't something born of flesh. It had always been there, dormant, waiting for the right moment. And now it was loose. But the worst part, what still haunts Torres every day, was the voices. They followed him. They were calling from within the walls. From the tunnels. They promised him freedom, but at what cost? He couldn't ignore them anymore. He couldn't even try. By the time the state police breached the perimeter, it was too late. They found the prison's population decimated. The survivors spoke of impossible things, bodies twisting inside out, shadows that screamed, and a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. The official report cited a mass riot triggered by contaminated food supplies, but the truth lay buried deeper, a truth too monstrous to confront. In the aftermath, as hazmat teams swept the facility, they discovered the sealed ward. The steel door had been torn from its hinges, its surface covered in symbols that made the photographer's eyes bleed. They could not identify the markings, ancient, yet not of this world. Beyond the door lay a chamber that defied explanation, an architecture that seemed to fold in on itself, as if the very space were warped by the dark energy that lingered there. The walls were inscribed with equations that drove the mathematicians mad, their eyes wide with terror before they were led away. They sealed it all away again, buried the bodies, and classified the files. Stillwater Maximum was decommissioned, surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. But Miguel Torres, the sole surviving inmate, knows the truth. From his cell in a different facility, he watches the shadows lengthen each evening. He listens for familiar voices in the dark. And every time they call, he knows they're getting closer. They told him he would be their messenger. That when the time came, he would guide them to where it all began. Because what escaped that night wasn't contained. It's spreading, moving through the prison system like a virus. And in cell blocks across the country, inmates are beginning to dream of a sealed ward and the power it promises. They dream of the red hour, knowing their time will come. The official death toll from that night stands at 143. But Torres knows better. He keeps his own count, marking the walls of his new cell. Because every night, that number grows, and somewhere in the darkness, something is still hungry. It waits for the next soul to cross its threshold. And one day, it will find him. Dr. Elizabeth Howard had taken the position as head psychiatrist at Ravenscroft Women's Correctional Facility despite her colleagues' warnings. The facility's reputation preceded it. 3 psychiatrists had resigned in the past year alone, each citing increasingly disturbing behavior among the inmates in the psychiatric ward. Still, Howard believed she could handle it. She had handled difficult cases before. She wasn't afraid of the dark histories of those behind bars, the ones that lurked beneath the surface of their fragile minds. But Ravenscroft was different. The ward itself was housed in the facility's Victorian-era East Wing, where tall windows stretched toward vaulted ceilings and antique mirrors lined the corridors, remnants of the building's past as a rehabilitation center for society's wealthy but troubled women. The administration had attempted to remove the mirrors years ago, but each attempt had been met with unprecedented violence from the inmates. Dr. Howard's first indication that something was amiss came during her initial patient interviews. Rebecca Mills, incarcerated for embezzlement, was sitting across from her, eyes darting nervously between Howard and the ornate mirror behind her. The reflection caught her attention too much, her lips moving as if speaking to someone in it. Her responses were increasingly disjointed. "Rebecca, tell me about your thoughts on rehabilitation here," Dr. Howard asked gently, trying to redirect her. Rebecca's eyes flickered again, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They're watching us. They've always been watching us. But now they're getting closer." Dr. Howard paused, her brow furrowing. "Who's watching you?" "They're always behind us. Always there, in the glass. They never leave," Rebecca muttered, voice trailing off. Before Dr. Howard could respond, Rebecca suddenly jerked her head toward the mirror, her face frozen in terror. "They're here," she whispered. "I can see them." "No! Don't come closer." Confused and concerned, Dr. Howard called in a nurse to escort Rebecca back to her cell, but the strange feeling lingered in the room. It wasn't the first time Howard felt that the air around the mirror seemed heavier. The incidents escalated gradually. Inmates began reporting seeing additional reflections in the mirrors, movements that didn't correspond to anyone in the corridors. Several claimed their reflections remained still while they moved, or worse, smiled when they weren't smiling. Even the most stable of patients began to report seeing people they didn't recognize, pale, lifeless faces that appeared for just a fraction of a second, watching them from behind the glass. One woman even swore her reflection had spoken to her, mimicking her voice, but with an unmistakably mocking tone. One night, Officer Janet Martinez, on her usual patrol of the ward, discovered the first message during her rounds. She paused at the guard station, pulling out her flashlight. Something on the wall caught her eye. Written backward, only legible when viewed in the mirror, were the chilling words, "We accept your offering." Frozen, Officer Martinez stepped back, her heart racing. She quickly grabbed a rag and tried to scrub it off, but the words wouldn't disappear. Instead, they seemed to get darker, as if the more she wiped, the more they etched themselves into the wall. Panicked, she turned and ran to the head nurse. "You have to come see this. Someone's messing with us. We've got a serious security breach." The nurse was already at the door, but when they returned, the wall was blank. No sign of the message. Only cold, clean concrete. Then came the night of the bed check. Dr. Howard had been reviewing the security footage from the previous evening. The cameras showed the inmates in their cells, sleeping peacefully. But something felt wrong. As she rewound the footage, she noticed the hallway mirrors catching glimpses of movement, but no one was moving in the cells. She zoomed in. In the handheld mirror on her desk, the reflection was not of her office, but of the ward's halls, and the women were standing in perfect formation, their heads tilted back at impossible angles, mouthing words in unison. No sound. Just the eeriest quiet, punctuated by the slow, deliberate motions of their disjointed necks. Shaken, she called Officer Martinez to report a strange behavior pattern in the footage, but when the officer arrived in the office, the footage had reverted to the normal footage, no women, no reflection. Only empty hallways. That night, during the 3 a.m. bed check, everything changed. Every mirror in the facility shattered simultaneously. But instead of falling to the ground, the fragments hung suspended in their frames, each shard reflecting a different scene, glimpses of a world that couldn't possibly exist. Beyond the shards, Dr. Howard saw things. Twisted forms, long and gaunt, staring out with hollow eyes, stretching impossibly long limbs as they crawled out from behind the glass. Inmates began speaking in voices that weren't their own, speaking in languages no one had ever heard. Describing a place, a world where the laws of physics were mere suggestions, and where the very concept of time had no meaning. The words sounded alien, yet achingly familiar. Something primal, buried deep within their subconscious. Dr. Howard was overwhelmed. She ordered an immediate evacuation, but it was already too late. As the guards rushed to unlock the cells, the reflections that had once stood innocently behind the glass, reached through and pulled them into that impossible space beyond. The facility split open, the walls warping in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Reality itself began to unravel. The sound was deafening, a low hum that made the air vibrate. The inmates stood by, watching with expressions so serene they could have been statues, while the world bent and snapped around them. When the state police finally breached the facility the next morning, they found the psychiatric ward completely empty. 147 women, inmates, guards, and medical staff had vanished without a trace. The only evidence of their existence was a series of photographs in Dr. Howard's office, showing each missing person. But in every single photo, the subject's reflection faced a different direction than they did. The official investigation concluded with a theory of mass hysteria leading to coordinated escape, but they couldn't explain the mirrors. Each one had been replaced, but the new ones showed the same strange phenomena, glimpses of women in antiquated dress, their eyes filled with patient hunger, peering from behind the glass. Ravenscroft psychiatric ward was permanently closed, the mirrors covered with thick black cloth. But the night staff still report hearing voices echoing through the corridors, hundreds of women speaking in unison, reciting what sounds like names. With each passing year, the list grows longer. Dr. Howard's final report, found on her office computer, contained only one line: they were never truly mirrors. They were windows. And now they've opened them all. Today, in women's correctional facilities across the country, inmates have begun requesting mirrors in their cells. They speak of dreams shared across hundreds of miles, dreams of a Victorian ward where the boundaries between reflection and reality dissolve, and where the women of Ravenscroft wait to welcome new sisters into their ranks. In a maximum security facility 3 estates away, a young inmate stands before her small steel mirror, watching as her reflection slowly turns to face her. Behind it, countless faces peer through the glass, their patient smiles promising liberation of the most terrible kind.